Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Long before superhero universes ruled every multiplex, and long before anyone could stream a season overnight, a scrappy little space adventure limped onto NBC's schedule and quietly rewrote the rules of American television. It debuted in the fall of 1966, drew middling ratings for most of its run, and was produced on a budget that forced its crew to improvise constantly. On paper, it should have been forgotten within a year. Instead, it became one of the most influential works of science fiction ever produced. Behind the phasers, the transporter effects, and the Vulcan salute, though, sits a mountain of strange, surprising, and sometimes downright bizarre production history. Here are 20 facts about the original Star Trek that even devoted fans often don't know. When Gene Roddenberry first sold the concept of Star Trek to NBC, the actor attached to the lead role wasn't William Shatner at all. The network's first pilot, The Cage, starred Jeffrey Hunter, an actor best known at the time for playing Jesus in the 1961 film King of Kings, as Captain Christopher Pike. Hunter's Pike was quiet, introspective, and burdened by command in a way that fit Roddenberry's cerebral vision perfectly. But when NBC asked for a second pilot, Hunter chose not to return. Accounts differ on exactly why. Some point to his wife's reservations about a television commitment. Others suggest Hunter simply saw the project as a step down from film work. Whatever the reason, the role passed to Shatner, whose more energetic, physical performance style ended up defining the character audiences know today. Hunter's own career faded afterward, and he died in 1969, following a fall, never seeing the cultural wave his abandoned pilot eventually helped create. The Spock that ended up on screen was noticeably tamer than the character Roddenberry originally imagined. Early concept art and writer's notes described a much more sinister-looking alien, complete with a deep reddish complexion meant to evoke something otherworldly and unsettling. The problem was practical rather than creative. In 1966, a large share of American households still owned black and white television sets, and test footage showed that a strong red tone rendered as an ominous, near-black smudge on those screens, not the effect anyone wanted for a main character. The production team pivoted to a pale yellow-green tint instead, subtle enough to look plausibly alien in color while still reading clearly in monochrome. Ironically, the tint was so faint that many color viewers barely registered it. It was the ears, not the skin, that ultimately sold the character's alien identity. Beaming has become one of science fiction's most iconic pieces of technology, but its origin story is far less glamorous than fans might assume. The show's writers originally planned to depict the Enterprise crew reaching planetary surfaces a conventional way, with a shuttlecraft ascending and landing on camera. That sequence would have looked terrific, and it would have blown through an already thin weekly budget almost instantly. Facing that reality, the production team needed something cheaper, and the solution they landed on was aluminum powder, or in some accounts backlit glitter, dropped in front of a black backdrop and filmed, then played back to create the shimmering dematerialization effect. It cost a fraction of a full location shoot, and could be reused endlessly. A budgetary shortcut ended up becoming one of the most recognized visual metaphors in all of science fiction, one that real physicists still get asked about at conferences decades later. Television pilots rarely get a second chance once a network passes on them, but Star Trek's did. The Cage was delivered to NBC executives who found it, in their own assessment, too slow-moving and too intellectually heavy for a general primetime audience. There was also discomfort at the network level with the show's female second-in-command, played by Majel Barrett, a character whose calm authority reportedly unsettled some executives more accustomed to conventional gender roles on television. Rather than shelving the project outright, however, NBC took the unusual step of ordering a second pilot, a rarity in the industry even then. Roddenberry restructured the crew, sharpened the pacing, and introduced Kirk as a new lead. Rather than let the original pilot go to waste, he later recut much of its footage into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, framed as a flashback narrative. That repurposed episode went on to win the Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, making a rejected pilot the only piece of original Star Trek footage to receive that honor. Nichelle Nichols occupied a genuinely groundbreaking position on 1960s television as Lieutenant Uhura, a Starfleet communications officer portrayed with dignity, competence, an authority at a time when black actors were rarely given roles outside of servant or background characters. Despite the significance of the role, Nichols grew frustrated with the limited material she was given and, after the first season, decided to leave the show to pursue a career on Broadway. She had already drafted her resignation when, at an NAACP fundraising event, she found herself in conversation with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who told her he was one of the show's fans. When she mentioned her plan to leave, King reportedly urged her to reconsider, explaining that Uhura represented something rare and valuable. Proof, broadcast in the homes across the country, that black women could be portrayed as capable professionals and equals in humanity's future. Nichols withdrew her resignation and stayed with the show through its full run, later describing that encounter as one of the most consequential of her life. The character most closely associated with Star Trek's legacy nearly didn't get played the way audiences remember. Leonard Nimoy had real reservations about Spock during early production. The prosthetic ears and the character's severe emotional restraint worried him. He feared the role would come across as gimmicky or monstrous rather than compelling, and that it might trap him in a novelty part for the rest of his career. Playing a character who deliberately suppressed emotional expression was also a significant departure from his training as an actor, and it took real effort to find a way to convey depth and humanity beneath that logical exterior. Audiences responded to exactly the quality Nimoy was worried about losing. The tension between Spock's discipline and his half-human heritage became one of the show's most compelling threads. Nimoy's own relationship with the character shifted dramatically over the decades, reflected in the titles of his two memoirs. The first, published in 1975, was called I Am Not Spock. The second, in 1995, was called I Am Spock. The scene in the 1968 episode Plato's Stepchildren, in which Kirk and Uhura kiss, is frequently cited as one of the earliest interracial kisses shown on American network television. Getting it on air wasn't simple. Network standards representatives pushed for the moment to be depicted as coerced, the two characters compelled to kiss by telekinetic alien captors rather than choosing the moment themselves, a framing that would let uneasy affiliate stations argue the scene wasn't a real kiss at all. During filming, Shatner and Nichols reportedly leaned into takes where the characters' expressions and body language read as genuine and connected, making it difficult for editors to avoid using footage that felt authentic rather than staged as mind control. The scene aired largely intact, and Nichols later recounted hearing from viewers, including some who had grown up in a strictly segregated environment, who described the moment as genuinely shifting how they saw the world. Star Trek never posted strong ratings during its original run, and NBC considered canceling it after both its first and second seasons. What happened in response had little precedent on American television at the time. Organized letter-writing campaigns, driven by fans with no digital tools at their disposal, sent an enormous volume of mail to network offices, with some estimates placing a combined total in the hundreds of thousands of letters across both campaigns. Grassroots organizing spread through science fiction conventions, college campuses, and word of mouth. The pressure worked. NBC renewed the show for a third season, a decision announced publicly at a science fiction convention, one of the earliest and most visible instances of a network reversing course because of direct audience mobilization. That third season, unfortunately, arrived with reduced budget and a difficult Friday night time slot, and the show was canceled for good in 1969. But it had, by then, accumulated just enough episodes to make national syndication commercially viable, setting up its far larger second life. The 11-foot studio model of the USS Enterprise, built for filming, remains one of the most recognizable spacecraft designs in fiction. What most fans don't realize is that the model builders only finished detailing the surfaces the camera was ever expected to show. The top sides and forward sections received careful paintwork, lighting rigs, and fine detailing. The underside of the ship, rarely if ever framed in a shot, was left comparatively rough and unfinished in places, since there was no budget justification for polishing surfaces the audience would never see on screen. The model itself now resides in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where restoration work over the years has addressed some of that original unevenness, but the production-era logic behind it says a lot about how tightly the show's resources were managed. Few lines are more associated with Star Trek than "Beam me up, Scotty." It has appeared on merchandise for decades and was even referenced by astronauts aboard the International Space Station. And yet that exact phrase, in that exact order, does not occur anywhere in the original series. What Kirk actually says across various episodes includes lines like, "Scotty, beam us up," or "Enterprise, beam me up," but never the specific combination that became the pop culture shorthand. This kind of drift between what a work actually contains and what popular memory insists it contains isn't unique to Star Trek. The phrase, "play it again, Sam," doesn't appear in Casablanca, and Sherlock Holmes never says "elementary, my dear Watson," in Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. Star Trek's case stands out, though, because the misquote arguably became more famous than any line the show actually delivered. Given how many distinct alien cultures the Enterprise crew encountered, viewers might assume an entire wardrobe department was dedicated to inventing new extraterrestrial fashion every week. In reality, the show leaned heavily on existing costume stock from the studio's wardrobe archives, the accumulated leftovers of decades of film and television productions. Robes originally built for historical epics were repurposed as ceremonial alien garments. Old Western costume pieces got new trim and different accessories to read as something from another world. This kind of resourceful recycling was common practice across low-budget 1960s television, and Star Trek's costume designers, most notably William Ware Tice, became especially skilled at reworking existing materials into outfits that felt convincingly foreign, at least for the few seconds a shot needed to hold. Starfleet's standard sidearm, capable of settings from stun to full disintegration, became one of the most recognizable prop weapons in science fiction history. Its origins were considerably less dramatic. The prop department began with inexpensive toy ray guns and novelty items pulled from existing stock, then modified them with added detailing, new paint jobs, and small mechanical elements to make them look more like plausible military hardware. Under studio lighting and with the right sound design, the effect worked convincingly on screen, even though close inspection reveals the toy-like proportions underneath. The concept had a longer afterlife than anyone likely expected. The idea of a directed energy sidearm went on to influence real-world research into laser and energy weapon systems pursued by military researchers in the decades that followed, a fictional prop feeding back into actual defense technology development.
The Trouble with Tribbles, the beloved 1967 episode featuring an infestation of small, purring, rapidly multiplying alien creatures, is remembered as one of the show's most purely fun installments. What audiences don't see is the minor technical headache the Tribble props created on set. Built from synthetic fur stretched over foam cores, with small internal motors in some units to simulate the purring sound, the props generated significant static electricity once they'd spent time under the intense heat of studio lighting. They clung to actors' clothing, stuck to furniture, and delivered small shocks to crew members, handling them repeatedly throughout a long shooting day involving hundreds of the props at once. Production staff had to develop routines for discharging the tribbles between takes just to keep filming moving smoothly, an entirely mundane technical problem hiding behind one of the show's most whimsical episodes. Anyone familiar with genre storytelling knows the term red shirt, the disposable, often unnamed character who accompanies the main cast into danger and doesn't survive the encounter. Star Trek didn't invent the general storytelling device of a minor character existing mainly to demonstrate stakes, but it did give the concept both its name and its visual shorthand. In the show's color-coded uniform system, red was worn by engineering and security personnel, the departments most frequently assigned to hazardous away missions. Fans who later tallied on-screen deaths across the series found that background characters in red uniforms died at a disproportionately high rate compared to those in gold or blue. The show never called attention to the pattern directly. It became something viewers absorbed gradually, and the term has since migrated well beyond science fiction fandom into general discussions of narrative structure, workplace culture, and even military strategy writing. Ask a casual fan to name Star Trek's signature villains, and the Klingon usually come up first. Within the original series, though, the Klingon were a secondary threat for much of the run. The Romulans were introduced earlier, in the acclaimed episode Balance of Terror, and were positioned as a more calculating, strategically minded adversary whose dynamic with the Federation echoed the tense standoff logic of the Cold War. The Klingon, introduced later in the first season, were written as a blunter, more overtly militaristic threat. Both factions appeared periodically throughout the original run, but neither dominated the series the way the Klingon eventually would once later films, and The Next Generation elevated them into the franchise's most iconic recurring antagonists and, eventually, allies. Kirk's reputation as a captain who trusts instinct over rigid calculation wasn't incidental to the writing. It was a structural choice the show's creative team returned to repeatedly. The ship's computer frequently appears as a kind of narrative foil, delivering cold probability assessments and discouraging courses of action that seem statistically unwise. Kirk regularly overrides those assessments and, within the show's internal logic, is usually vindicated by the outcome. Airing at a moment when computers were only just entering broad public awareness, this recurring beat functioned as a pointed statement about the limits of pure calculation versus the value of human judgment, moral intuition, and lived experience, a thematic debate that, in the era of algorithmic decision-making, has aged into something considerably more relevant than it might have seemed in 1966. Gene Roddenberry wanted the show to do more than entertain. He intended it as a vehicle for commentary on contemporary American life, filtered through a science fiction lens far enough removed to slip past nervous network standards departments. In an era when direct references to civil rights struggles, the Vietnam War, or Cold War tensions risked being cut from scripts entirely, Roddenberry's writers routed those same arguments through alien allegory instead. The third season episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, features two humanoid characters, each half-black and half-white on opposite sides of their faces, locked in a centuries-long war over which arrangement of coloring is superior, an unmistakable commentary on the irrationality of racial hatred, delivered without ever using the words racism or civil rights. Other episodes engaged with themes of war profiteering, blind political conformity, and religious fanaticism, all displaced onto distant planets and future centuries. Network censors, apparently, found it much harder to object to a metaphor than to a direct statement. Not every piece of Star Trek's production history is dramatic or politically significant. Some of it is simply strange. At one point during the show's run, cast members went into a recording studio and produced a holiday-themed album, intended largely as a promotional novelty rather than a serious commercial release. William Shatner's performances leaned into theatrical, spoken-word delivery rather than conventional singing, a style that would later become something of a signature for him on other recording projects. Leonard Nimoy contributed spoken-word material in a similarly dramatic register. The recordings weren't widely distributed at the time and faded into obscurity for years before bootleg copies began circulating among collectors.